The projector beam cut through cigarette smoke and salt air as 200 North Korean soldiers sat transfixed in a makeshift theater on Geoje Island. The year was 1951, and these men who had crossed the 38th parallel, expecting to liberate the South, now watched Hopalong Cassidy chase bandits across the American frontier on a portable 16mm screen. This wasn't how wars were supposed to end for communist soldiers. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, I'd love to know. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten history, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the past. The transformation began 18 months earlier, on June 25, 1950, when North Korean artillery shattered the pre-dawn silence along the 38th parallel. Private Kim Sung-ho of the 4th Infantry Division had awakened to the thunder of Katyusha rockets and the distant rumble of T-34 tanks rolling south. Like 90,000 of his comrades, Kim believed they were liberating their Korean brothers from American imperialism. The propaganda had been clear. They would sweep the corrupt Southern government into the sea within weeks. By November, Kim found himself among 130,000 North Korean prisoners, shackled in the hold of an American landing craft, listening to the unfamiliar growl of diesel engines as Geoje Island emerged from the morning mist. The smell of salt spray mixed with vomit and unwashed bodies in the cramped cargo hold. Beneath his feet, the metal deck plates vibrated with each wave impact, a rhythm that seemed to echo his own uncertainty. The island that would become his home stretched before them, like a barren moonscape, rocky hills dotted with sparse vegetation, surrounded by waters too cold and distant from the mainland for any realistic escape. What Kim couldn't know was that American engineers were already transforming this desolate outcrop into the largest prisoner of war complex in modern history, a sprawling city of numbered compounds that would house more souls than most Korean cities. The first shock came during disembarkation. Instead of the brutal forced marches Kim had expected, American guards processed the prisoners with mechanical efficiency. Identity photographs, medical examinations, delousing stations, each step documented with the same attention to detail that had characterized the logistics miracle of the Incheon landings. The Geneva Conventions, a document Kim had never heard of, governed every aspect of his treatment, but it was the sounds that first suggested something unprecedented was happening. As guards escorted Kim's group toward Compound 15, he heard something impossible drifting across the barbed wire, the tinny voice of a radio announcer speaking Korean, followed by American jazz music. In North Korea, private radio ownership was forbidden. Only party-approved broadcasts reached civilian ears. Here, loudspeakers mounted on wooden poles broadcast news from the BBC, Voice of America, and Radio Seoul throughout the camp complex. The cacophony of foreign voices created an audio landscape unlike anything Kim had experienced. English, Chinese, Korean dialects, mixing with the mechanical sounds of generators powering the camp's electrical grid. The barracks that became Kim's new home were crude wooden structures, long and low, with canvas roofs that leaked during the island's frequent rains. Straw mattresses lined the floors in neat rows, and American-issued blankets bore the stamp of a civilization that seemed to possess unlimited resources. But even these basic accommodations contradicted everything Kim had been taught about American POW camps. The daily routine established by November 1950 combined military discipline with something entirely unexpected: scheduled entertainment. Each evening, after rice and corned beef rations, guards would announce movie screenings in the compound mess halls. Portable projectors, their cooling fans whirring in the humid air, would flicker to life as prisoners gathered around makeshift screens hung between wooden posts. The first film Kim witnessed was a U.S. Army information short about democratic elections, followed by a Hollywood Western starring Roy Rogers. The experience overwhelmed his senses, the mechanical clatter of the projector, the heat from its lamp mixing with wood smoke from cooking fires, the sharp chemical smell of heated celluloid. But most disorienting of all was watching his fellow prisoners laugh at the comic antics of Roger's sidekick, Gabby Hayes. These men, who had been trained to hate American culture, were being entertained by it, and they seemed to be enjoying themselves. The contradiction gnawed at Kim's understanding of the world. If Americans were the cruel imperialists described in North Korean propaganda, why were they showing movies to their prisoners? If the United States was a failing capitalist state, how could they afford such elaborate entertainment programs for captured enemies? What Kim didn't yet realize was that these movie nights were part of a carefully planned psychological warfare campaign designed to accomplish something far more ambitious than simple entertainment. American intelligence officers had concluded that the most effective way to counter communist indoctrination wasn't through harsh treatment, but through the overwhelming evidence of Western prosperity and freedom. But if you think movie nights were shocking, wait until you discover what happened when these isolated soldiers heard their first uncensored news broadcasts from the outside world. The crackling voice of a BBC announcer cut through the evening air on Geoje Island as Private Kim Sung-ho huddled with 40 other prisoners around a small loudspeaker mounted on a wooden post. December 1951, and the words coming through the static would shatter everything these men thought they knew about their war. This was the moment when isolated soldiers discovered that truth had many voices, and they had been hearing only one. The radio programs began each morning at 0600 hours, when American guards would tune shortwave sets to Voice of America's Korean service. The sound of uncensored news felt alien to men who had grown up with single-source information. Kim pressed closer to the speaker as the announcer described battles from both sides' perspectives, casualty figures that didn't match North Korean claims, and most shocking of all, detailed reports of Chinese involvement that contradicted everything they'd been told about their volunteers from across the Yalu River. For Kim, who had believed Chinese troops were merely advisors, hearing BBC correspondents describe massive People's Liberation Army offensives created a cognitive earthquake. If the Chinese were fighting in division-strength formations, why had North Korean officers called them technical advisors? If American forces had been driven back from the Yalu River, why did the camp's American guards seem so confident about their ultimate victory? The Information and Education Program, launched by U.S. Army instructors in early 1952, expanded these questions into systematic doubt. Twice weekly, prisoners filed into crude classrooms where American officers and civilian volunteers conducted lectures with titles like How War Came to Korea and Democracy and Totalitarianism. The contrast between these presentations and North Korean political education was jarring. American instructors encouraged questions, admitted uncertainties, and presented multiple viewpoints on complex issues. Corporal Lee Myung-soo, captured near Seoul in September 1950, later wrote in his diary, "The American teacher asked us what we thought about different economic systems. In North Korea, asking such questions would mean interrogation by security police. Here, they wanted our opinions." The daily routine that emerged by spring 1952 revealed the systematic nature of this psychological campaign. Morning roll call at 0700, followed by work details that mixed forced labor with vocational training. Prisoners learned carpentry, metalworking, and basic English skills that had obvious post-war applications, but also demonstrated American confidence that these men would eventually return to civilian life. But it was the evening programming that created the deepest impact. After mess hall dinners of rice, canned meat, and powdered milk, guards would announce the night's entertainment schedule. Radio programs from 1900 to 2000 hours, followed by film screenings until 2130. The variety overwhelmed prisoners accustomed to uniform political messaging. One evening brought a Voice of America documentary about American agriculture, complete with statistics about grain production that dwarfed anything North Korea had achieved. The next night featured a Hollywood musical where Bing Crosby crooned about prosperity and romance to audiences of dirt-poor Korean farmers' sons who had never imagined such casual wealth. The sensory experience of these programs created lasting memories. The sharp ozone smell from overheated radio tubes mixed with cigarette smoke and the salt air that perpetually swept across the island. Prisoners learned to recognize the distinctive whine of shortwave receivers, hunting for clear frequencies, the sudden clarity when atmospheric conditions aligned, and the frustrating fade-outs that left news reports incomplete. Kim discovered that different compounds received different programming based on their political classifications. Communist hardliners in Compound 76 heard primarily educational broadcasts and stern lectures about democratic governance. Anti-communist prisoners in Compound 22 enjoyed more entertainment programming, including popular music, and Hollywood features that camp administrators hoped would reinforce positive impressions of American culture. The psychological warfare aspect became clearer as winter turned to spring in 1952. American loudspeaker operations weren't random entertainment. They were carefully calibrated to counter specific communist messages. When North Korean radio claimed American forces were retreating, camp broadcasts would feature detailed reports of UN advances. When communist propaganda described widespread starvation in South Korea, prisoners would hear BBC correspondents describing reconstruction efforts and American food aid. The most powerful tool proved to be simple comparison. Prisoners could tune between Radio Pyongyang's strident claims and BBC's measured reporting of the same events. The contrast was stark. North Korean broadcasts proclaimed inevitable victory, while foreign correspondents described stalemate and negotiation. Communist radio insisted American forces were collapsing, while camp guards demonstrated calm confidence in their ultimate success. Private Kim began keeping a mental tally of contradictions. North Korean propaganda had claimed American soldiers were poorly equipped conscripts. Yet, the guards possessed advanced communications equipment, reliable vehicles, and seemingly unlimited supplies. Communist broadcasts described American racism. Yet Kim observed white, Black, and Hispanic guards working together without apparent friction. The evidence of his eyes contradicted the certainties of his indoctrination. The vocational training programs added another dimension to this psychological bombardment. English classes taught practical conversation skills alongside American cultural concepts. Students learned to say "thank you" and "please," courtesies that North Korean military training had dismissed as bourgeois weakness. They studied basic civics, learning about elections, representative government, and individual rights that existed nowhere in their homeland experience. But the most subversive element wasn't the formal programming. It was the casual abundance displayed in every aspect of camp operations. American guards discarded half-eaten chocolate bars, threw away cigarettes with inches remaining, and operated equipment with a carelessness that suggested unlimited replacement. For prisoners from a society where every resource was rationed, this waste seemed almost obscene. Radio batteries died and were immediately replaced. Film projectors broke down, and repair parts appeared overnight. Even minor conveniences like hot water for shaving and electric lighting for evening activities demonstrated an industrial capacity that made North Korean claims about American weakness seem absurd. Yet none of this prepared Kim and his fellow prisoners for what happened when spring screening operations began in April 1952. American officials would soon discover that exposure to uncensored information had created an entirely unexpected problem. Thousands of prisoners no longer wanted to go home. The metal folding chair scraped against concrete as Private Kim Sung-ho entered the screening tent on April 15, 1952. Across a small wooden table, an American officer shuffled through forms, while a Korean interpreter adjusted his glasses. Outside, the sounds of Compound 15 continued prisoners arguing. guards walking patrol, the distant hum of a generator powering the camp's electrical grid. The question that would shatter the Korean War's assumptions was deceptively simple. Do you wish to return to North Korea after the war? Kim stared at the interpreter, processing words that had never formed a choice in his mind. Return home had always been inevitable, assumed, beyond question, but 8 months of radio broadcasts, movie nights, and glimpses of American abundance had planted seeds of doubt that now bloomed into terrifying possibility. I need time to think, Kim stammered, his voice barely audible above the tense flapping canvas walls. The screening process that began in earnest that April revealed the psychological transformation American information warfare had achieved. Of the 170,000 prisoners held across Geoje's numbered compounds, UN officials expected perhaps 10% to refuse repatriation. Communist prisoners, they assumed, would naturally want to return to their homeland, regardless of temporary exposure to Western propaganda. They were catastrophically wrong. In Compound 22, where anti-communist prisoners had organized under former South Korean officers, screening teams discovered that 90% refused repatriation. But even in communist-controlled compounds like 76, where political cadres maintained strict discipline, 30 to 40% of prisoners expressed reluctance to return north. The numbers staggered American officials who had planned for a simple prisoner exchange. The sensory details of screening revealed the psychological pressure on individual prisoners. Kim remembered the smell of mimeograph ink on freshly printed forms, the sound of electric fans struggling against the humid coastal air, and the texture of rough wooden benches where prisoners waited their turns. Each interview lasted 15 to 20 minutes, but the decision being asked would determine the rest of their lives. Compound leadership reacted to screening with increasing violence. Communist cadres who had maintained order through political education and social pressure now faced mass defection of their followers. In Compound 76, political officers established people's courts that tried suspected traitors in midnight tribunals. Prisoners who admitted interest in staying in South Korea faced beatings, isolation, and, in documented cases, execution by improvised weapons. The internal warfare escalated throughout April and into May. Pick handles from work details became clubs, tent poles sharpened into spears, metal mess kit fragments ground into cutting edges. The barbed wire that was supposed to keep prisoners in now separated warring factions within compounds, as communist loyalists battled anti-communist groups for control of barracks, mess halls, and political meetings. Private Lee Chang-ho, held in Compound 14, witnessed one of these trials in his diary. They brought Park Sung-min before the People's Court at midnight. His crime was telling the screening team he wanted to stay in the South. 5 men held him while the political officer read charges. They beat him with tent poles until he couldn't stand. We found his body in the latrine pit the next morning. The violence created an impossible situation for American camp administrators. Geneva Convention rules prohibited interference in prisoner internal affairs, yet compound battles were producing casualty rates that exceeded some Korean War skirmishes. Guards could hear the sounds of fighting, screaming, metal against wood, bodies hitting barracks, walls, but were forbidden from intervening unless prisoners attempted to escape. The crisis reached its peak on May 7, 1952, when Brigadier General Francis T. Dodd made his routine inspection of Compound 76. The communist leadership had planned his capture for weeks, using information gathered from prisoners who worked in camp administration. As Dodd entered the compound gate for his weekly meeting with prisoner representatives, dozens of men swarmed the American general and dragged him into a barracks. The sound of the camp's alarm system, a hand-cranked air raid siren, echoed across Geoje Island as news of Dodd's capture spread through the compound network. From his barracks window, Kim could see American guards running toward Compound 76. their boots pounding wooden walkways that connected the camp's sprawling complex. The siege that followed transformed Geoje from a prisoner camp into a negotiation venue. Communist prisoners who held Dodd presented specific demands: cessation of forced screening, recognition of compound self-governance, and guarantees of humane treatment. But their most significant demand was for written acknowledgement that American camp administration had violated Geneva Convention principles. For 3 days, the standoff continued. American officials negotiated through loudspeakers, while communist prisoners held signs visible from guard towers demanding international recognition of their grievances. The irony was stark. Prisoners who had been exposed to democratic ideals through camp information programs were now using those same principles to justify revolt against their captors. The resolution came when American negotiators agreed to written concessions that prisoners later broadcast throughout the camp network. General Dodd's release statement included the phrase, "I can assure you that in the future, the prisoners of war can expect humane treatment in this camp." The words seemed innocuous, but communist propagandists would use them to claim that Americans had admitted to previous brutality. Kim listened to the negotiated settlement being read over the compound's loudspeaker system on May 10th. The carefully worded language revealed how profoundly the camp experience had changed all participants. American officials had been forced to acknowledge prisoner grievances while maintaining their authority. Communist leaders had secured concessions while remaining captives. Individual prisoners like Kim had discovered that their choices could influence international negotiations. But the Dodd incident had also revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American information warfare. The same democratic principles that made movie nights and uncensored radio broadcasts possible also gave prisoners the tools to resist American authority. Teaching men about individual rights inevitably led to questions about their own captivity. The psychological transformation was nearly complete, but the most profound revelations were still to come. As screening operations resumed under tighter security, American officials would discover that their information campaign had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations and created problems they had never imagined possible. The transport ship's engines thrummed beneath Private Kim Sung-ho's feet as he stood on the dock at Incheon Harbor, August 12, 1953. Behind him, 83,000 former prisoners lined up for repatriation to North Korea. Ahead of him, 22,000 others, including Kim, waited for transport south to new lives in the Republic of Korea. The final numbers told the story of the most successful psychological warfare campaign in modern military history. Operation Big Switch, the massive prisoner exchange that followed the Korean Armistice Agreement, signed on July 27, 1953, revealed the stunning success of American information operations on Geoje Island. Nearly 1 in 4 North Korean and Chinese prisoners refused repatriation to communist territory, a rejection rate that shocked negotiators on both sides and redefined the rules of prisoner of war treatment. The statistics that emerged from 3 years of camp operations painted a picture of systematic ideological transformation. Of the 170,000 prisoners held at peak capacity, final screening results showed that 68,000 North Koreans and 14,000 Chinese chose to remain in South Korea or Taiwan rather than return to communist rule. These weren't coerced decisions. Multiple verification interviews, neutral nation supervision, and extended cooling-off periods confirmed that prisoners understood the permanent nature of their choice. For Kim, the decision crystallized during the final screening interview in June 1953. Sitting across from a Swiss Red Cross official in a neutral tent, he articulated thoughts that had been building for 2 years. In North Korea, I was a farmer's son, with no future except following orders. Here, I learned to read English, operate machinery, and think for myself. How can I return to a place where asking questions is treason? The camp experience had fundamentally rewired the prisoners' understanding of possibility. Radio broadcasts had revealed a world beyond Korean borders, where ordinary people owned automobiles, chose their leaders, and criticized their governments without fear. Movie nights had shown societies where individual dreams mattered more than collective ideology. Vocational training had demonstrated that technical skills could provide economic independence, unavailable in communist systems. The sensory memories of transformation remained vivid decades later. Former prisoners recalled the taste of their first Coca-Cola, distributed during a camp Christmas celebration in 1952, a sweetness that represented abundance they had never imagined possible. They remembered the texture of American-made tools during metalworking classes, precision instruments that made improvised North Korean equipment seem primitive by comparison. Most powerfully, they recalled the sound of uncensored laughter during movie screenings, the spontaneous joy of people experiencing entertainment without political messaging. The humanitarian implications of mass repatriation refusal created unprecedented challenges for international law. The Geneva Conventions assumed that prisoners naturally wanted to return home after conflicts ended. When tens of thousands refused repatriation, negotiators had to invent new legal frameworks for voluntary repatriation that balanced individual choice with state sovereignty. The principle established at Geoje that prisoners could choose their post-war allegiance would influence POW treatment for generations. The integration process for non-repatriates demonstrated American confidence in their ideological victory. Rather than simply releasing former enemies into South Korean society, USN authorities established transition camps where ex-prisoners received 6 months of additional education, job training, and cultural orientation. They learned about democratic governance, market economics, and civil society concepts that existed only theoretically during their captivity. Private Kim's diary from his transition period captured the psychological adjustment. Yesterday, I voted in my first election, choosing local representatives for Busan City Council. 2 years ago, such an action would have been inconceivable. Today, it feels natural, even necessary. Democracy is not just a political system. It is a way of thinking that transforms how you see yourself and others. The economic integration proved remarkably successful. Former prisoners brought valuable skills learned in camp vocational programs to South Korea's reconstruction effort. English-speaking ex-POWs became translators and liaisons with American aid missions. Those trained in metalworking and carpentry found immediate employment in rebuilding projects. Most importantly, their exposure to American industrial methods contributed to the technological knowledge that would fuel South Korea's eventual economic miracle. The psychological warfare lessons learned on Geoje Island revolutionized military thinking about information operations. American strategists realized that the most effective way to counter totalitarian ideology wasn't through harsh treatment or traditional propaganda, but through overwhelming demonstration of democratic prosperity and freedom. The camp experience proved that people exposed to genuine choice and abundance would naturally reject systems based on scarcity and control. The long-term vindication of this approach became clear in subsequent decades. South Korea, defended by American military power and rebuilt with American aid, evolved into a prosperous democracy that attracted millions of refugees from the communist North. The former prisoners who had chosen freedom in 1953 found themselves on the winning side of history, their children growing up in a society that validated their parents' courageous decision. By the 1980s, when South Korea hosted the Summer Olympics, former Geoje prisoners could watch their adopted homeland showcase its prosperity to the world. The radios and movie screens that had first exposed them to possibilities beyond communist control had become symbols of the transformation they had chosen and helped create. The camp, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and movie nights that once seemed like minor diversions had accomplished something. Military force alone could never achieve the voluntary conversion of enemy soldiers into democratic citizens. The entertainment that North Korean prisoners had expected to be propaganda proved to be something far more powerful, a glimpse of what life could become when people were free to choose their own destinies. Private Kim Sung-ho, who had crossed the 38th parallel in 1950 as a communist soldier, died in Seoul in 2006 as a successful businessman and grandfather of 5. His funeral was attended by dozens of fellow former prisoners who had made the same choice at Geoje Island over half a century earlier. They had witnessed the power of information to transform hearts and minds, and their lives became testament to democracy's ultimate victory in the contest for human loyalty. The radios still played, the movies still flickered, and freedom still won.